Lords of War, Elves vs. Lizardmen, Volume 1. Written by Martin Vaux, read by Tom Barratt. Part 2. The Summoner's Call. Brother Unsek pulled his cloak tight around his body and ensured his face was truly obscured. Around him sunlight streamed in the bright of the afternoon, and crowds of lizardmen, from the most enormous to the tiny, rushed this way and that, all pushing their way towards the Colosseum. From within the rickety structure, part hewn from hard flint rock, part constructed from innumerable tree trunks lashed together with vines, a great roar erupted. The games had begun. As Unsek pushed forward through the crowd, a few of the lizardmen before him fell to their knees to let him pass. Beneath his broad, deep hood, the old lizardman smiled. The flowing black cape he wore, adorned with pink and blue shells, was the unmistakable uniform of the Gesh Brotherhood, the high priests and political messengers of the nation of Sauria. They existed above the clans, immune from partisan violence, respected by all, at least in theory. Unsek extended one upturned hand and beckoned those around him to stand. They did as he commanded, scurrying off towards the Colosseum, hungry for mayhem and violence. The wide black hoods worn by the Gesh were meant to both obscure their individual identities, whilst also making them conspicuous. With every single countryman around them being so brightly coloured, to dress in black was an anomaly. The only more radical shade which had at one time been contemplated was white. But white was a colour associated with purity, and nobody was under the illusion that the machinations of the Gesh were pure. Pushing on through the throng and into the wide entryway of the Colosseum, Brother Unsek pushed left, clambering up the side of the stalls and looking for a place to sit. Once he spied one, away from the crowd, he launched himself towards it, bounding from empty pew to wooden guardrail, sailing through the air and rebounding again to eventually arrive at his destination. Once there, he again ensured that his cloak was tightly wrapped around his body, and he settled in to watch the fights. The most recent bout had just ended, and the corpse of the fallen was being cleared away. King Tetras, the great turtle, had recently slain yet another foe for the glory of Clan Testudos. Tetras was unusual, opting to represent his clan as champion himself rather than appointing a proxy to do his fighting for him. The great turtle was, of course, a gargantuan and terrifying warrior, his enormous shell making him all but unassailable, and his huge bulk meant that should he ever manage to grasp a foe, all he usually needed to do to defeat them was suppress them under his vast weight. If the king of the Testudos was feeling vicious, however, as he seemed to have been today, he would leap onto his opponent, most often crushing all life from them and sometimes reducing them to an unrecognizable mess of flesh and bone. This latter fate had been played out onto the erstwhile champion of Clan Spheno, Aeneas Redmane, who now represented but a smear on the sand of the Colosseum floor, which was hastily being cleared away by another of the amphitheatre's many attendants. Unsek was not there to witness yet another slaughter at the hands of King Tetras, however. Tetras's support was already secured, and a bale of his most vicious leatherbacks were already lumbering towards the temple at Zotl. The Gesh had sent Brother Unsek to the Colosseum that day to gauge the abilities of a new, young fighter, whose usefulness was still within question. As the Colosseum floor cleared, the crowds in the stalls fell silent. On either side of the wide battleground, vast gates were being gradually drawn up, and the two new contenders emerged. As they did so, a slow building roar grew. Clawed feet stamped, and frenzied screams, hoots, and howls filled the air. From the left-hand gate, a huge, hulking creature emerged. Unkala Rutis, a rising star from Clan Theros, stepped out onto the sand. He was a Rexor like his clan's ruling champion, Junkata Coldblood, at whose hand he had lost an eye during a recent bout. Even in this disfigured state, Unkala was a much-feared warrior who had slain innumerable foes in his time. As challenger, his bout today was about qualifying him to again face off against Junkata, to not only claim the title of champion, but also to have his revenge. Out of the gate on the other side of the arena, however, another shape stepped out into the bright sun. In contrast to Unkala, this warrior was lithe and slender, almost half the size of Unkala Rutis. On first sight it looked like there was to be no contest. This slight, lithe warrior was the combatant Unsek had come to see. Zundua the Brave, champion of Clan Sauros, had never lost a battle. King Ankis, ruler of Clan Sauros, had specially requested that the Gesh take an interest in the young warrior, and so Unsek was here. Dressed only in a light leather jerkin, Zundua's entrance into the Colosseum proved decidedly elaborate. His bright turquoise scales glinted in the sun as he danced out across the sand. He twirled in the sunlight, drawing his long, slender tail around in circles which flicked sand away from him, leaving intricate patterns in the floor of the Colosseum. Furthermore, as he pirouetted, he spun his long wooden spear, into the head of which a long, sharpened dragon tooth had been set. The tooth was a gift from King Ankis, an artifact allegedly prized from the jaws of Dothrak's silver scale long, long ago. As Zundua danced and spun, shifting his weight from one bandy leg to the other as he went, a large contingent of the crowd laughed, pointing claws and jeering Unkala Rutis. The Rexor from across the arena was far from amused by his opponent's showmanship. By contrast, Unkala's scales were dull browns and greens. His weapon was a long iron sword, its blade mounted in an old tree root, and on his other stubby arm he carried a modest-looking shield. While the mass of gathered observers watched on, Zundua's extravagant entry into the Colosseum showed no sign of stopping, so Unkala made ready to fight. The great beast stomped his huge feet into the sand, flicking huge clumps backwards, and he leaned forwards, making to charge. The Rexor snorted, leaning his head back to emit a deep, thundering roar, then powered forward, his mighty legs churning up the ground and pounding the arena floor. A little way away, Zundua continued to dance as if nothing had changed. Unkala was powering towards him, jaws open, but still the blue-scaled lizard-man hopped and skipped, whirling his spear and whipping his tail back and forth. As Unkala ran, his one good eye focused in on the slight blue shape, and in his short arm he raised his sword, making ready to follow up on his first attack. The Rexor came within striking distance and snapped his colossal jaws closed around the rapidly moving blue shape. But by the time his jaws had closed, Zundua the Brave had somehow danced out of the way, off to Unkala's shield arm and out of striking distance. Unkala, rather than pivoting around with his sword, saw an opening to use his other lethal weapon, his tail. The giant Rex whipped around, slamming his tail down onto the sand, onto the spot where his lithe opponent had been but a moment ago. But once again, Zundua's slender form had twirled out of the way. Brimming with rage, Unkala Rutis now swung wildly with his sword, hacking the air this way and that, but Zundua the Brave was too fast, too agile, too cunning. Unkala was left panting and growling, stamping his feet again, unsure as to what his next actions should be. In this moment of inactivity, Zundua finally began his counterattack. His first action was to leap around to Unkala's rear, angling his spear down and driving it deep into the Rexor's tail. Every lizardman in the crowd could see, clear as day, that the dragon-tooth head of the weapon had not only pierced the hardened skin of Unkala's tail, but had, in fact, passed clean through it and deep into the sand of the arena floor, pinning the Rexor where it stood. As Unkala snarled, vainly snapping his jaws, Zundua then clambered up Unkala's tail, back and neck, coming to a stop with one spindly leg on each of his foe's broad, muscular shoulders. As Brother Unsek watched on from the stands, his stomach turned. He somehow knew what was coming next. Zundua the Brave plunged his hand forward, grasping tight with his claws and snapping his arm backwards. The crowd went wild as the young champion held aloft Unkala Rutis's other eye, which he tossed into the air and then swallowed whole. With his short arms, Unkala Rutis was powerless to reach up and grab Zundua, or even touch his now empty eye socket, which pulsed and coursed with pain. It was Zundua who, almost politely, turned and slid down Unkala's back, grasping his spear and removing it as he slithered down towards the earth and freeing Unkala to move once again. Rather than mounting a counterattack, Unkala instead fell to his knees in supplication. Zundua, meanwhile, leapt up onto the sand and pointed his spear out to the stands. The lizardmen watching him began to chant his name. "Zundua! Zundua!" they bellowed, pumping their scaly fists in unison. Zundua flicked his green tongue in and out of his mouth and tossed his spear to one side. He raised his arms up high above his head, clenched his fists, and then brought them down suddenly to shoulder level. As he did so, he also fanned out his spectacular blue neck frills, off of which the sun reflected, seeming to crown the young warrior in a halo of blue frozen flames. As Unkala knelt in the sand, he opted not to move. He could attempt to flee, but where would the honor be in such a thing? He was truly beaten, outclassed and outmatched in every way. His aspirations to become champion for his clan were dashed, and his life as a warrior was over. His best hope now was for death. As Zundua the Brave lowered his neck frills and gathered up his spear, all present expected him to grant Unkala his inevitable wish. Instead, however, the slender blue lizardman simply padded back across the sand towards the gate out of which he had emerged. The crowd was disappointed, of course, but Brother Unsek watched on and noted that the young champion's actions in that moment made him not less feared by his fellow lizardmen, but more. After all, what kind of vicious creature would think to leave a crippled warrior to live and not put him out of his misery? As Unsek raised himself up in the stalls and made his way towards the fighters' chambers, he felt conflicted, which was something not many guests should say all too frequently. On the one hand, he thought this young warrior's efficacy was of no doubt. Zundua the Brave was a vicious and capable combatant, a fighter who knew that victory was about winning the mental battle against an opponent as much as the physical. With this in mind, Zundua would make a superb addition to the force the clans were assembling at Zottel. On the other hand, however, Brother Unsek now had to go and speak to the spirited, deadly warrior, and for some reason, even as he made his way through the parting crowds, he felt deeply and darkly afraid.